Hey everyone, let's go back to the fall of 2020, where many states were still effectively locked down with coronavirus restrictions. Businesses were forced to close, which brought on massive unemployment. And when you're unemployed, you're likely to have issues paying the bills, including paying your rent. In the meantime, the next coronavirus package was being held up in Congress, which would have potentially included tens of billions of dollars in rental assistance. And with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans facing eviction, months before a presidential election, the Trump administration had to do something about it. So on September 4th, 2020, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Health and Human Services issued an agency order to temporarily halt residential evictions in the United States under the guise of preventing the further spread of COVID-19, and cites a provision in U.S. Code Title 42 under interstate quarantine. The provision basically says that if the CDC director finds that health authorities in the state aren't doing enough to prevent the spread of communicable diseases to other states, that the CDC director can take action. And those actions include the following: inspection, fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, pest extermination, and destruction of animals or articles believed to be sources of infection. Now, if you think you missed the part that can be interpreted as giving the CDC the right to halt evictions, well, you didn't. It's not there. And if this is the first you're hearing about the details, it's because nobody talked about it or criticized it. I mean, think about it. President Trump's overreach here was practically a gift to Democrats and the news media. But instead, they were oddly quiet and didn't litigate it because the policy was keeping people in their homes through the end of the year in the middle of tough times. Now, while the moratorium was taking place, a few things happened. First, the vaccine was approved for emergency use, which means that Americans could begin to get vaccinated and get back to work safely. And then, on December 27th, Trump signed into law the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which provided up to $25 billion in funding for households that were unable to pay rent or utilities. And in that bill, Congress extended the eviction moratorium through January 31st. But then, on January 20th, 2021, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the new CDC director, announced that she was extending the moratorium to at least March 31st. Now, this is a problem because the CDC is not a legislative body, and it does not have the authority to do this, which I will explain shortly. In the meantime, Congress passed and President Joe Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act, which provided up to an additional $21.5 billion in emergency rental assistance. However, the act, which was passed overwhelmingly by Democrats, did not extend the eviction moratorium. Why? Probably because of the $47 billion in funding available to assist renters. Yet despite billions in funding, which was more than enough to cover both renters and landlords, the CDC extended the deadline yet again, this time to July 31st. In the meantime, lawsuits challenged the order, including one from the Alabama Association of Realtors, who had sued the Department of Health and Human Services, claiming that the moratorium exceeded the CDC's statutory authority. And on June 29th, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to stay the eviction moratorium. In other words, they voted to keep the order in place, but it doesn't mean that the majority of the justices agreed with it. Let me explain. Justice Kavanaugh basically said that he would have voted to vacate, but didn't because the moratorium was ending in only a few weeks, and that would give extra time for state and local governments to catch up and distribute the funds. He also stated, "In my view, clear and specific congressional authorization via new legislation would be necessary for the CDC to extend the moratorium past July 31st. And unfortunately, by not vacating the CDC's order, Kavanaugh left the door wide open for the Biden-Obama administration to play games with the Constitution." So with the CDC's moratorium expiring on July 31st, and the Supreme Court making it very clear that the CDC didn't have the authority to extend it, that should have been the end of it, right? Susan Rice, director of the White House's Domestic Policy Council, put it this way: It's fundamentally the responsibility of state and local governments to get relief in the hands of renters and landlords. However, that was the problem. On July 31st, it was reported that of the $46.5 billion in funding allocated by Congress, only $3 billion had been distributed. In a statement, Joe Biden said, with localities across the nation showing that they can deliver funds effectively, there can be no excuse for any state or locality not accelerating funds to landlords and tenants that may have been hurt during this pandemic. Of course, it's not that simple. Most states and localities didn't have anything in place to accept applications, and these claims take time and manpower to process and investigate. And there could be hundreds of thousands of renters who are not eligible for funding. But also, there are many landlords who haven't applied for the federal funding because of the strings attached. It prevents them from raising the rent for a whole year after aid is received, and it forces them to allow tenants to remain in the property for a whole year. And for a lot of landlords, that's not an option. Take, for example, this woman, Vanny Mangal, a landlord whose tenants have not paid rent in over a year and have been abusive towards her. So understandably, she wants them gone, but applying for landlord assistance would force her to let the tenants stay. And for the renters who are ultimately not eligible for funding and won't be able to pay, all the eviction moratorium is doing is delaying their evictions and forcing landlords to lose even more money in the process. So in a last-minute effort, Democrats tried to introduce legislation to extend the moratorium, but Republicans blocked it. And with good reason. Congress had already provided the funding. It's not their problem anymore. And the White House seemingly accepted defeat, saying that President Biden would have strongly supported a decision by the CDC to further extend this eviction moratorium to protect renters at this moment of heightened vulnerability. However, the Supreme Court has made clear that this option is no longer available.
To date, the CDC director and her team have been unable to find legal authority even for a more targeted eviction moratorium that would focus just on counties with higher rates of COVID spread.
Anyway, after a looming deadline and Congress going on a 6-week recess, it looked like the moratorium was finally finished. But then, activist congresswomen like Cori Bush and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped up their game and got the media's attention. And that intense political pressure from the squad supposedly forced Biden's hand, and he made the decision that the eviction moratorium needed yet another extension, regardless of its illegality.
And I want to make it clear. I told you I would not tell the Justice Department or the medical experts or scientists what they should say or do. So I don't want to get ahead. The CDC has to make this. I asked the CDC to go back and consider other options that may be available to them.
So Joe Biden was like, I said I wasn't going to tell them what to do, but then I told them what to do. But wait a minute, didn't the Supreme Court make it clear that the CDC isn't allowed to do this?
I've sought out constitutional scholars to determine what is the best possibility that would come from executive action or the CDC's judgment. What could they do that was most likely to pass muster constitutionally? The bulk of the constitutional scholarship says that it's not likely to pass constitutional muster. But there are several key scholars who think that it may, and it's worth the effort.
Now, it shouldn't matter if a so-called constitutional scholar thinks that it may pass or not, because the Supreme Court has already made it clear that it won't. It's already settled.
I told them I want them to take a look. I didn't tell them what they had to do. And my hope is it's going to be a new moratorium that in some way, and I'm not going to announce it now, let them announce it, in some way covers close to 90% of the American people who are renters.
Here, Biden claims that he hasn't seen what the CDC has come up with and hopes that it's going to be a moratorium that will cover close to 90% of renters. But at the same time, he's shown the policy to constitutional scholars to get their opinion on the policy he supposedly hasn't seen. So what did the CDC come up with? The moratorium would now only apply in communities with substantial and high levels of community transmission, which according to their reasoning would be about 90% of renters. See what they did here? The Supreme Court said that the CDC's nationwide eviction moratorium was unconstitutional, but the new CDC order isn't technically a nationwide moratorium because it only affects 90% of renters. In other words, it's semantic bullshit. The moratorium is the right thing to do to keep people in their homes and out of congregate settings where COVID-19 spreads. And the wrong thing to do is blatantly violate the Constitution. But old joke Biden's gonna do that anyway.
At a minimum, by the time it gets litigated, it will probably give some additional time while we're getting that $45 billion out to people who are, in fact, behind in the rent and don't have the money.
Biden is hoping that by the time the issue makes its way back to the Supreme Court, that the deadline will have already passed. This is called gaming the system. So Kavanaugh could have taken a firmer stance on the issue and voted to vacate the order, but he didn't. And then the Biden administration took advantage. Lesson learned, I guess. Finally, listen to Joe Biden in one sentence show how blissfully unaware they were about the whole eviction crisis.
We were under the impression that the states were moving this money out relatively rapidly.
So what this means is that the Biden administration knew that the eviction moratorium was ending, but didn't bother to monitor the distribution of rental assistance funds. And then no one in the administration knew that there were issues getting the money out. But that's okay, because to make up for it, Biden is not only willing to stomp all over private property rights and due process for landlords, but he's also willing to break the law and violate the Constitution, all in plain sight. And with that, thanks for watching, sharing, and slamming that like button. Be sure that you're still subscribed to the channel. Check out these videos that you may have missed. And as always, I hope to see you next time, if there is next time.